Hi folks, today we're going to talk about altering your text to make your text more readable. One job of a designer is to take large amounts of information and lay it out on a design to make it more efficient for people to read. By default, when you open up any document, either InDesign, Microsoft Word, Google Docs, your default sizes are going to be 12 point and an auto spacing. Particularly in InDesign, we can actually customize that to be even more specific beyond the single space, double space that you normally get within Microsoft or Google products. So the column on the left, this text column right here, is all standard. It's minion, 12 point, everything's on auto, straightforward, right out of the box, ready to go. And that's easy. That's good. That's a good starting point. But it's not the point for designers, because designers, again, we like to customize everything in order to make it more efficient for people to read. And what that comes down to a lot of times is spacing and font selection and font size. Oftentimes, a document or a product that we're working on may be dictated by the amount of space we have. In this case, we're going to imagine that we have a little bit more space to kind of spread some things out. One thing I always like to do when I start off a text document or working on a text document, a lot of times I do this beforehand and set the parameters of what font I want to use, what size I want it, what the leading I want to use. And these are the three terms we're going to talk about here is leading, which is the space between lines. Then there's tracking or word spacing, which is the space on a line between each letters or between words. And then there's what's also called kerning, which is a little bit more specific, and I'll have a different video for that. So those are three ways you can control type in order to take up space and to create space, however you decide you want to use it in any combination. So the text box I have on the right, let me zoom in a little bit here, is standard as well. Same thing as mirrors the one on the left. But in this case, when I usually start a project, I always want to change the font size. Depending on what font I want to use, I'm going to use a pretty standard font that's pretty easy to work with, and that's Helvetica. New, regular. So standard Helvetica. Depending on the project, I might use a different font. I might use Helvetica Light for certain things or Helvetica Medium for other things. But I'm just going to start off with Helvetica Regular. And there you go. It's already set at 12 point. It seems a little bit a larger font. If you were to compare sizes between the two, it's a larger typeset than the other one. I tend to want to bring my font sizes down to about larger than standard, because again, default reading is 12. To go larger would also indicate that you're trying to speak to a different audience, such as those who have maybe visual impairments or need corrective lenses in order to read. The aging population tends to want a larger font because it's easier to read. It's easier on their eyes, less eye strain. But not all documents need to be in 14 point. There's a specific population who want 14. For general reading, especially for resumes or for even books and textbooks, it's usually going smaller. And related as we go, and the idea for a designer is to set this before you do a 200-page document, because you can set the parameters and know what the specs are, or the parameters for each project. And you can see here, I take up the same amount of space on the page allocation, but it makes the text a little bit more readable or a little bit more lighter when I add some leading to it. The other thing you can do, and I want to zoom in a little bit, to help give wording more space, is that you can go to the control right below leading, and that's known as word spacing or line spacing. Depending who you talk to, it has a different, may have a different definition, but the idea is that you can create space between all the letters on a specific line. So again, default is 0, and let's say I want to just increase it by 50. So the space between the words, or word tracking, is wider. And I'm just going to make it a little bit more dramatic for effect. And now you have this document which is a little bit more spaced out. Oops. It's 10 point. It's got a word tracking that's 200 points, and it's a little bit wider. And then you have an 18 point leading, which so gives a little bit more breathing room, and ultimately can make things easier to read. And the track, or the kerning, I'll say for a different lecture, because it's kerning, just for reference, it's the space between specific letters, particularly that will be repeated over and over again, that needs to be corrected. Fonts are built for legibility, and then designers take the font and space it for readability. Legibility is being able to discern an F from an N, or an F from an E, N from an M. Those are the characteristics that we see in lettering. But readability is creating or using your tools, leading, tracking, font size, and even kerning to make it a little bit easier to read overall. As you can see here, this is maybe a little bit dramatic, but again, which one is easier to read? They're both 10-point font, but one has an easier time to read because it has increased spacing. So a lot of times what you might want to think of is to decrease the size of the font, but increase the spacing to take up the same amount of space. But that will ultimately lead to a little bit easier reading process. In this case, I could probably go down to 9 point. And it's still fairly reasonable to read, but again, it brings it back and kind of makes it, again, it takes up space, but doesn't seem so dense. And again, anything you're working on that's going to be ultimately printed, the best way to read it and judge it is to print the document and to try it out and see how effective the spacing works. If you have any other questions, let me know. Thanks.